Hello, men and people of all other genders as well. Welcome to the first ever mental health stream. And the purpose of this stream is to create an environment and create a place where men can talk about mental health, where men can learn the skills and understandings necessary to improve their mental health, as well as really to just have an environment of open dialogue that will help men grow and thrive. And while it's focused on men, we really need everyone. So, uh, welcome, one and all. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about video game addiction in particular, as well as men's mental health, using some questions that I got on a Reddit AMA that I did just this last Sunday. If you have any questions, please do go ahead and ask them in the chat. I aim for this stream to be as engaging as possible. So if there's anything you want to know more about, if there's anything that you want to push back on, if there's anything that you have questions about, please go ahead and ask. And with that being said, let's just go ahead and get right into it. So the first question is, what is the difference between video game addiction as a standalone condition versus it being a symptom of other issues like depression and ADHD? I really like this question, and I think it's important to note that they put video game addiction in quotes. And one of the things about the term video game addiction, despite the fact that I use it, is it's not actually my favorite way to describe what's going on here. And in fact, a lot of times I think it's kind of an inaccurate way to describe what's going on. And when it comes to someone using video games excessively or kind of compulsively, the way that I think about it is that video games are not the issue. There's the solution to an issue that someone has in their life. And in fact, oftentimes they do a really good job of solving the issue that the person has and meeting some kind of underlying need. And for me, when I was in the throes of my addiction, so to give you a little bit of a backstory, I'd been playing video games about 16 hours per day at its peak. And it was at the point where my social life had deteriorated. I was failing school and failed for pretty much 2 years straight. And even my physical health was declining. So to this day, I have an injury in my right wrist. And if I use my wrist too much, it becomes tense and I experience pain. And when it comes to what was driving me to play so many video games, as it turns out, it came from a place of being incredibly anxious, incredibly shameful, and incredibly insecure. And the way that video games helped me deal with that is I wouldn't feel those things while I was playing, first of all. Second, I was actually pretty good at video games, which gave me the sense of feeling competent or feeling good enough that I didn't have in other areas of my life. And then because I was spending so much time playing, I had dug such a big hole that when I left the game world, I felt terrible. When I was in the game world, I felt great. And so ultimately, that and other things as well led me to continue to play more and more and more until it was at a point where uh, I was just terrified to spend any time in my own head. Um, and for so many people, this is the case when it comes to video game addiction. The video games themselves are not the thing causing the addiction. It's the fact that it's meeting some kind of underlying need and doing so, again, really effectively, as well as I think one of the things that's underrated is how energy efficient it is to meet your needs this way. So video games do not take much physical energy, and your brain absolutely loves that. So when you play video games, your mind releases dopamine, which to oversimplify something that's pretty complicated, it's the chemical that signals to your brain that what you're doing is rewarding. And it takes very little physical energy to get that dopamine. Even more so, your brain doesn't differentiate the dopamine that you get from, say, playing a video game from having an achievement in real life. So as far as your mind is concerned, the achievements that you're running into in game are just as real as achievements that you would be running into in real life. So when it comes to this specific question about it being symptoms of other issues like depression or ADHD, video games actually do a really good job of helping someone cope with depression or ADHD symptoms. In specific, video games are really good for the ADHD brain, they're extremely naturally stimulating. And one of the things that the ADHD brain absolutely loves is something that will keep you stimulated, as well as something that will change consistently. So they're just really easy to focus on for a long period of time. And a lot of people with ADHD will tell you that video games are the one thing that they don't have a hard time focusing on, that it's actually very easy to focus, which feels really nice. When it comes to depression, once again, it's kind of like this low energy thing that is relatively easy to do to get a sense of achievement. It can also help in not feeling so many of the things that you're feeling. And even furthermore, can transport you to a world or a place that is just much more enjoyable to you. All this to say that it's very rare that I see video game addiction show up as a standalone condition. And it's almost always the case that if someone is using video games, there's something underlying that is causing video games to be much more appealing than it would be for the general public. This is why I really wish people would not feel such a sense of shame over being addicted really to anything, but in this case, specifically video games, because to some degree, if you're really suffering with something, if something's causing you a lot of challenge, and you can go ahead and do something like play a video game and almost instantaneously not be suffering, why would your mind not want to do that? And why would your mind not get hooked on that? It just makes sense that people's minds end up really hooked on something like a video game when they're suffering really badly. And I think one of the other neat or more hopeful things about this is that people can really get to a place where they can enjoy video games simply to enjoy them and not to sort of meet an underlying need once they address that need. And so much of the work that I've done individually in therapy has been helping people find other ways to meet these needs and helping people to find balance so that they can enjoy playing video games from a more healthy standpoint once again. So my own personal path out of this involved really recognizing that so much of my anxiety was around failing, and that kind of ironically, spending 16 hours playing video games was causing me to fail. And once I really understood this pattern and started to make some adjustments, and again, to make a very long story that I'd be willing to share sometime more in the future, very short, I recognized that what I needed to do was embrace the possibility of failing and go all out in school. And that involved confronting the anxiety around failing. And as I did that, I started to feel better about myself. And I literally felt less desire to play video games in that way. It became less appealing for the purpose of avoiding failure, as well as gaining a sense of achievement. Because I was really just gaining that sense of achievement from other areas in my life. And it became more of a social thing the more that I played. So the simple answer to this question is it's rarely a standalone condition. Video game addiction is oftentimes the solution to a problem that someone has in their life. And if you go and meet the needs that the person has underneath the addiction, oftentimes the addiction gets better. And there's still a need to address the habitual component. But ultimately, this is the path to finding balance. All right. Next question. Do you still play video games? And is it better to go for balance or for abstinence when it comes to video games and technology? I played video games for a very long time, even after my severe addiction. And so, as I spoke about last time, and as you can tell in the answer I'm about to give you, I really think the best approach for most people is to try to find balance when it comes to their video game use and video game addiction. So I was playing for about 16 hours per day. I was told that I would be kicked out of university. And I started playing less and less from that point forward. So one of the things that was actually incredibly helpful for me was I started taking really long walks, either before I played or in between my matches or at the end of my day. And during these walks, I would just think about what I was feeling and where I was at. So naturally, I started playing a little bit less then. And I got to a point where I started to recognize the reasons that I was playing, how much of a problem it was. and I started to reintegrate other things back into my life. And naturally, as I started doing that, I was spending less and less time playing video games. So I ended up re-enrolling in school, doing so full time, as well as working a job. So naturally, I wasn't able to play as many video games as I used to when I was playing for 16 hours and not going to any of my classes. So, in order to find a balance at that point in my life, what I decided and what I ended up committing to was something that my parents had told me to do a long time ago, which I was pretty damn salty about because I didn't want to admit that my parents were right. And, it was really painful to recognize that this strategy worked for me. And so, what I ended up doing ultimately was deciding I am always going to take care of my responsibilities first. And once I've taken care of my responsibilities, I can game as much as I want. Eventually, I added on to that and said, not only am I going to take care of my responsibilities, I'm going to attend to other important things in my life first, such as my social life or my health and well-being. And stuck with that rule that I could play as much as I want as long as I got that stuff done. And for a long time, that's exactly what I did. So that meant some days I would have like 10 hours or more to play games. Some days I would have just like 2 hours, and some days I would have no time, especially on days where I had homework, went to class, and also worked. What I discovered in doing that is that the time that I spent playing video games actually felt even better, which is not what I was anticipating. I wasn't expecting that I would have more fun playing games, playing less of them, but it just felt good knowing that I didn't have to worry or feel burdened about all of the other stuff that I had to get done. So in finding this balance, I was getting stuff done. I was moving my life in the direction that I wanted to, and I was taking care of my health. And ultimately, I found a way to play video games and enjoy them, as well as find balance. However, one of the things that I realized is no matter what I was doing, I was always kind of like desiring having more time to play video games, which is really tough for me because it felt like I was just kind of living my life to play video games. And once I realized this, I started to make even more changes. I realized that I was neglecting a lot of other parts of my life. And over time, the amount that I played has just decreased and decreased and decreased. And ultimately, I love video games. I think video games will always be a part of my life. I think they'll always be an important part of my life. But for the last year and a half or so, I've played almost no video games except for on occasion with friends socially. And this isn't because I think that they're bad or that I don't want to play them. It's just because I'm really busy doing other things that I enjoy doing. And there's a point in the future where I'll likely play more video games. Tears of the Kingdom is a game that has really excited me recently. But right now I just have priority on other things. And when I have more space and time that I'd like to allocate to video games, I'll certainly go back to that. So when it comes to the idea of going full abstinence, when it comes to video game and technology addiction, I would say for most people, this is actually a poor approach. And that's one of the ways that video game and technology addiction really differs from a lot of the typical line of thinking when it comes to dealing with addiction. And one of the things that I think is important to recognize when it comes to video games and technology is that, again, they're not inherently bad or inherently unhealthy. They're kind of like tools, and the way that you use the tool is what determines whether or not they're healthy or unhealthy. Another way to say that is that the difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. And if you're doing it too much or excessively, that's what causes it to be a challenge. One of the things that I noticed is initially I tried to approach it in terms of like, hey, you need to completely abstain from this thing. It's taking over your life, because that's been sort of the conventional addiction knowledge. And one of the things I've done in a lot of the therapy that I've offered is I've used feedback from my clients as well as measurement at the beginning and end of every session. And in doing so, I've recognized that trying to push abstinence really doesn't work and sometimes has the opposite effect. It makes people push more towards their addiction and makes it harder for people to give up. In approaching it from a standpoint of balance, I've seen people have a lot more success, as well as really be able to get back to a point where they appreciate video games again. And with all of that being said, it seems to me that for most people, taking about 2 weeks off from whatever video game or technology they're using excessively tends to do a lot to help them reset, especially their habits around their video game or electronic use. So while I don't necessarily recommend abstinence, I do recommend people try to take an extended period of time away and use that time to do things that are fulfilling or enjoyable, and especially things that are highly engaging for you. So, you'd have a really hard time going from this ultra stimulating thing like a video game to just like reading a book. And in fact, if you're really used to super stimulating things like video games, you'll notice that reading a book is really hard. So I wouldn't suggest trying to replace it with that, but instead something that's maybe more like active or engaging, like rock climbing. Again, I just happen to already enjoy walks in nature, so I did a lot of walking. A lot of people find themselves wanting to go to gym just because they think, not because they think, but because it factually is good for their health, and people realize that that's something that they value. But after that, I really suggest reintegrating the video games in a way that's more balanced and more in line with your life. And if you like the strategy that I spoke about here of taking care of all the other aspects of your life and then giving yourself as much time as you want to play video games, please go ahead and do it and try it. I really suggest just trying things and seeing what works for you. And when it comes to the portion of the population that would benefit from abstinence, of all the people that I've worked with, and I've probably worked with upwards of 100 people on this topic at this point, I would say only 2 of them really needed to go the approach of abstinence, and they found that they just for some reason couldn't find a balance. I'm not necessarily able to talk about why that is in a definitive way. I think more research would need to be done in that area to talk about that. But I can say one commonality between the experience of these 2 people is that when it came to their use of the technology, they just found themselves always wanting more and getting completely lost in what they were doing in a way that it almost felt like they couldn't be conscious or mindful of how much time they were spending. And that's pretty typical, pretty common. And that's one of the reasons that I really advocate for taking a break for some period of time, because it can really help with that. But ultimately, I think if you're trying to achieve balance use and you're doing that repeatedly and you see that it's not working, that's a really good sign that you're going to have to try abstinence and see how that works for you. Yeah. Overall balance, I think, over abstinence is the answer for most people. And I found a lot of joy in playing video games in a balanced way. That was somehow nicer than playing video games when I was so addicted to them. At some point, it just like isn't even fun. I'm doing it just because of the habit and just because it feels terrible not to play. And it's so nice to be at a point where you're using the technology in the video games because of the joy that it brings you, instead of, trying to escape from negative feelings. All right, next question. What is considered a video game addiction? What conditions have to be met to distinguish between a regular person who plays them in their free time versus someone who is addicted? This goes back to that saying, the difference between the medicine and the poison is the dose. And a lot of times when people ask this question, they're hoping for a specific hour amount. They want to know how many hours you have to be playing a week to be considered addicted. And especially in a world where video games are getting more and more complex, and you actually have to invest like sometimes even an hour or 2 of time to meaningfully play the game at all, the hour amount that can be considered healthy when playing a game really is starting to change. That being said, too, there's things like esports, and I think a lot of esports athletes are playing a lot of video games and doing so in a very healthy way. And so ultimately it's very dependent, but there's a guideline that I can give you to determine whether or not you might be playing too excessively. And that guideline is this: is your video game use taking you away from the life that you want to live? Or in other words, if your video game use is causing a problem in your life, then it is a problem. If it's not causing a problem, then you might be okay. However, one of the things that's tricky with video game use is some of the problems that it causes can be really under the radar compared to other addictions. And it can also be really easy to justify it away because playing video games can be such a healthy thing. and is such a societally accepted thing, and for a good reason, because they are fun and they can be really nice. And in fact, there can be a lot of benefits to playing video games. So when it comes to some of the common problems that people have when video game use becomes a problem for them, just like with myself, one of those would be having a hard time academically or having a hard time with your job because of the video game use. That's maybe one of the more obvious ones. Having a hard time with your relationships, neglecting your social life to play video games, which to some degree, video games can be very social. In fact, again, that's one of the ways that I enjoy playing video games to this day. But socializing in a video game is not a replacement for real life socializing. There's things that come from real life socializing that are important, including the reciprocal body language, the ability to see and speak to someone, and some of the physical interaction that just can't be replaced by a video game. Although video games can be helpful for meeting social needs, such as during the pandemic. So if your video games are stopping you from socializing, that might be a sign that you have a problem with your video game use. Some of the other kind of under the radar things, or things that are maybe a little bit less expected, include having less access or understanding in terms of what it is that you're feeling kind of unmotivated to do anything besides play video games, and constantly being occupied with thinking about the games that you're playing, even while you're doing other things. These are all signs that your mind has really habituated to playing too many video games. And without going too much into the neuroscience of it, there are changes that can happen in your brain from playing video games too much and too long. And these changes make it harder to identify what you're feeling. They make it harder to be motivated by sort of like normal and less stimulating things. So for me, at the height of my addiction, going to the grocery store was extremely painful. I was just so bored. It felt like the worst chore ever. One of the things that surprised me the most was just how much I could enjoy grocery shopping after I spent a long time away from playing video games, because it just felt like the worst thing ever. And so if your mind is incredibly focused on playing video games and desiring it over all else, that might be another sign that it's sort of causing a problem in your life. If you become kind of like irritable or angry when people mention how much you're playing games or ask you to get off them, that might be a pretty good sign that you have some kind of excessive video game use. And let me think for a moment and see if there's any other big ones that come to mind. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of different things. Certainly, if it's affecting your physical health, like I mentioned before, I mean, on top of just not really doing much physically and not being very physically active, which of course isn't good for your health, I injured my wrist as a result of playing so much. I played a lot of League of Legends, and for those of you that play, I mained AD carry, and right-clicking and moving the mouse so much really did a number on my wrist. And to this day, if I do anything that's wrist intensive, my wrist becomes sore, fatigued, and painful. I would say, besides that, another really common and kind of under the radar problem that it can cause is the lack of desire to do other things that you would want to do in your life because they just seem too effortful. These and more are some good signs that you might have a problem with video game use. And again, the real rule of thumb is that if it's causing a problem for you or preventing you from living the life that you want to live, then it's a problem. And I really, really encourage being honest with yourself about whether or not that's the case. And that doesn't mean you have to give up video games completely, but what it does mean is that you might need to take some steps so that you're using them in a healthy way and can actually get to the point where you're enjoying them purely. Okay. Ooh, I love this question, and it gets to the topic of our community. Why is it that men appear more likely to become addicted to video games? I, as a woman, love video games, but I would say that I've never played them enough, despite playing a lot in my youth, to make my parents concerned about me being addicted. even when they were up against me, playing as much as I could through a new Mario game, for example. One interesting thing about this question is the mention that their parents were not concerned, because one of the things that actually uh, might be a part of this is this person may have had parents that were just generally less concerned about them being addicted. Whereas I think some people's parents might be on the hyper vigilant end. Some people's parents might be on the less concerned end. And I think some might be in this sort of middle place. So that might be a factor in this individual commenter's question. But what I was more interested in was this question about why is it that men appear to be more likely to become addicted to video games? And this is true. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but there are a lot of reasons that I can see anecdotally, as well as in research, as to why men are more likely to become addicted to video games. The first of which, and this is really dear to my community, is that when men are suffering, men are much less likely to seek help for challenges and much more likely to turn to external solutions to deal with what's going on internally in them. All that to say, when men are suffering, they look to try to fix it externally instead of dealing with what they're feeling. And part of this comes from this idea that as men, we're not supposed to have negative feelings and we're not supposed to struggle with them. So if you can do something like turn to a video game and suddenly you're not feeling those things anymore, which by the way is literally what happens. When you play a video game, your mind is not thinking about all of the things that you're feeling and you feel instantaneous relief. It reinforces the idea that when you start to have negative feelings, you should go to video games to fix them. Because as far as your mind is concerned, whatever you did worked. And when it comes to this idea of suffering and not being able to turn to someone, that's the other thing too, is a lot of times there can be some support from gaming communities and in a way that feels more accessible. So, I just think of people talking about having a hard time and memes about like, same bro, it's just very easy to talk to the boys in a way that isn't too intimate or vulnerable about having a hard time, and then to just kind of distract yourself with the game. The other one is that while more and more females are playing video games these days, gaming culture and social gaming is just much more normalized among males to this day. I'm kind of glad that this is changing. I'm glad that video games are becoming sort of like a non-gendered thing. And at the same time, playing video games, playing them a lot and playing competitively has typically been viewed as a very male thing. And I think especially the types of games that tend to be most addicting, as well as the qualities of these games that tend to be enjoyed by the male audience, tend to pull more men into addiction. So for instance, really competitive games, MMORPGs, typically male dominated audience at this time. And I think those games just are much better at kind of sucking people in and absorbing their time. The next one actually has to do with male brain development, particularly in the frontal lobe, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for impulse control. And so for males, this part of your brain develops much more slowly than it does in females. It's interesting because over time, this number seems to be pushing further and further back. And I'm not sure if that's because we're developing more slowly or if we're doing a better job of tracking brain development. But what we do know is that women's brains, as far as I last checked, tend to stop developing around 25. And again, the last thing to develop is this frontal lobe that's responsible for impulse control. And males tend to stop closer to 28 or 30 years old. So if you think about it this way, in adolescence, one of the things that teenagers are notorious for are having really strong emotional reactions to things. And part of this is because they have a really strongly developed emotional creation center of the brain. And then this sort of like impulse control center of the brain that's responsible for managing feelings and interacting with feelings is underdeveloped. So another way to say it is teenagers kind of are all gas with very minimal developed brakes. And this is especially true for males. So if they find a really engaging way to deal with their feelings and have difficulty controlling impulse, I think this makes it just much more likely that they start to have a harder time with addiction and kind of falling into compulsive gaming instead of gaming intentionally. There's one last piece of this as well, which is that males actually seem to have more brain activity in the mesocortical limbic center of their brain when they're playing video games. And to take a very fancy word and make it very simple, it's the part of your brain that's associated with reward. So men literally get more dopamine or more reward from playing video games. And again, this might actually be because men are conditioned to find things like competition and achievement more rewarding or to derive more of a sense of value from it. And this is something that, once again, I hope to be breaking. I hope to live in a world where our value is not based on achieving or competing or dominating over other people. But as of right now, that's the way that it is. And I think some of these things are the biggest factors that contribute to video game addiction being more prevalent in males. All right, we're on to the very last question. Any stream viewers, I'm happy to accept any questions from you after that, but if not, we'll go ahead and wrap up the stream there. So the question is, what's been your biggest challenge as it comes to talking to men about underlying or sometimes overt misogyny? I think a lot of times misogyny in men is very misunderstood. And I'm going to take this to mean in this case, hatred or prejudice against women. And when I've worked with men who have viewpoints that may be considered misogynistic, what I've seen underneath them is some really deep suffering and hurt that is not being acknowledged. And I don't say that to deflect responsibility, because ultimately it is the responsibility of the person to examine and respond to their beliefs better. But what I've come to realize as I've worked with men who really on the surface appear to be very misogynistic is that there's a bunch of things that are not being understood in terms of what is driving some of that behavior. And that in taking the time to understand the person, they're able to make different choices. And by the time the person gets to me, one of the biggest challenges is the way that they've interacted with some of these beliefs about themselves or the beliefs around women have really furthered or created self-fulfilling prophecies that have dug the hole of these beliefs even deeper than they were before. So for instance, one really common belief that I'll hear from men who are in this place is that women only want to date men who are super attractive or super successful. And so what this does is it causes them to not feel very confident. They approach a woman that they're interested in, and they do so in a way that is kind of sheepish, or maybe they do so in a way that's kind of aggressive or already presupposing that they're going to get rejected. And then, one thing too is that it's completely reasonable for someone to not want a relationship with someone. But when you have this belief, as soon as you're rejected, your mind says, it must be because I'm not attractive enough and because I'm not good looking enough, which then turns into women are shallow people for rejecting me and not wanting a man like myself. And so by the time that I meet this person, this belief feels more and more true to them because of how they interacted with it. And then because they're so afraid of being rejected, they may have stopped talking to women at all, which doesn't give them any kind of alternative perspective. So the biggest challenge is not invalidating the experience of the person in front of me who legitimately has kind of proven to themselves at this point that some of these beliefs that they have are true. And it's really hard to ride the line sometimes between showing someone understanding, validating their experience, and then not continuing to allow them into these patterns for which they're hurting themselves and the people around them. And with that being said, what I've found over and over again is that by giving people that understanding, by helping them understand what's happening, they're able to make changes and oftentimes are able to do so in a way that allows them to see a different side of the world. I've been really amazed at how much people can change, as well as the softness that can come from people once you give them a sense of understanding, and do so while also giving responsibility and accountability. So I want to be really clear, and I'm noticing there's a part of me that really worries that what will be heard in what I'm saying here is that, it's not their fault, they're just hurt. What I'm saying is they're hurt and it's still their responsibility. And the more that we can give people understanding for why they hold the beliefs that they hold, the more able they are to understand themselves and take responsibility for responding differently. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is sort of breaking through those walls, as well as yeah, we're really taught as men that we're not supposed to feel hurt and we're not supposed to feel rejected and upset and sad. And so being able to sort of work past some of those beliefs and some of the conditioning, I would say, is really the biggest challenge. So all that being said, thank you to all of you who are listening. Thank you for all who attended. I'll be streaming every Tuesday and Thursday, answering your questions and doing interviews related to men's mental health. So thank you for tuning in. Until next time, I'm Adam Holman. Goodbye.